Sergeant Tyson was supposed to be the watchdog inside Avery's trailer, making sure that Manitowoc officers couldn't plant evidence. But every time he was asked how closely he watched them, his answer was the same: to the best of my ability. Before we dive in, a quick reminder: in the last 90 days, almost 90% of people watching weren't subscribed. If that's you, hit that button so you don't miss the next part of this trial. It's 100% free and helps support this channel. Thanks. Today is day 7 of the Steven Avery trial, and today is a big day. We have the cross-examination of Sergeant William Tyson, the testimony of Sergeant Andrew Colborn — we've heard a lot about him so far — and then Lieutenant Link, someone else's name we've gotten very familiar with. We won't get to all of them in this episode. That would make this about 6 hours long. I'm not willing to record that long in one session, and you probably don't want to listen that long in one session. But we are going to get to them very, very quickly, because I'm just as curious about what they have to say as you probably are too. With that said, let's get started with day 7, and Sergeant William Tyson is the first to testify. The court is called into session. They call the case number, the attorneys all identify themselves, and the defense attorneys say that Steven Avery is in the room with them. And then Sergeant William Tyson is called as a witness, having first been duly sworn, was examined and testified as follows. The clerk says, "Please be seated," has him state his name and spell his last name for the record. And then the cross-examination begins by Attorney Buting, one of Steven's defense attorneys. "Good morning, Sergeant." "Good morning. Let me start right off by directing your attention to November 5th, first arrival at the scene. Okay? Remember that?" "Yes, sir." "You testified yesterday that you arrived at, I believe, about 2:45. It was about 5 minutes to 3 by the time you got up to where the RAV4 was located. Does that fit with your recollection?" "Correct." "All right. And I don't know if you need to refresh your recollection with your report. Just let me know if you do. Okay?" "Okay. But from what I understand, it appears that you left that area at 3:10 p.m., just 15 minutes later?" "Correct." "You were called back to the command center to do some other assignments?" "Correct." "And during that 15 minutes, when you first arrived, was the RAV4 covered with a tarp or was it uncovered?" "It was uncovered." "Okay, but during that 15 minutes is the period of time when the tarps were put over the RAV. Isn't that right?" "Yes, they were attempting to get that tarp in place." "Okay. And you testified about that. And you were actually one of the people who helped put it over the RAV4? "I never physically touched the tarp. I did assist with getting some objects, I believe, from a vehicle that was right next to it." "Okay. To secure it down, to prevent it from blowing away." "Okay. So you were just helping as others were building this, like, tent-like object over the RAV?" "That would be accurate, yes." "Okay. And you were taking extreme care. Everybody was taking extreme care so that the tarp wouldn't actually touch the RAV4 itself?" "Yes, all the officers were very conscious of that fact." "So there was space around it, underneath the tarp, right?" "They were trying to do the best they could to make sure that the top of the vehicle was not touched by the tarp." "Okay. And that was completed. That operation of putting the tarp over it was completed by the time you were called away to the command center, right?" "They were still working on it when I was relieved of my duties. There were some issues. The winds were picking up. I know they were trying their best to get that situated. I don't believe, to the best of my recollection, that was totally finished by the time I was released." "Okay. But largely covered, being able to weigh it down still, is the gist of it?" "I think that would be accurate." "Making some adjustments, perhaps?" That would be accurate. Okay. So if we heard other testimony that showed that the RAV4 was still completely covered with the tarp at 4:16 p.m., then that would mean for at least 1 hour the RAV4 was covered. Would that be right? Yeah, it was. Like I said, I left at 10 minutes after 3. They were still doing some adjustments to it. So, yeah, if you hear testimony at 10 after 4, I was not down there, so I don't know for sure. So, you never went back to that site? Correct. The rest of the night, you never went back to see the RAV4 yourself? I believe later on in the evening, after the canine dogs had searched the area, I was down in that area, but not near the RAV4. I was down by the pond area and through the lanes, but never really directly by the RAV. By the way, did you see, can you can you tell me when you first saw Lieutenant Link at the Avery salvage that day? My recollection, the first time I saw Lieutenant Link would have been up at the command center on the top of the hill. All right. Well, would that have been the first time you got there, or would that have been later? Which time? It would have been after I cleared from the Toyota RAV. We were up at the command center. There were officers who I did not know at that time. I never met these officers, was introduced to those officers. Okay, so around 3:15 or so is when you think you were introduced to Lieutenant Link up at that command center. I can't be sure if he was on scene immediately when I got there or if he showed up a half hour later. I really don't know for sure what time he showed up on scene. Okay. What about Sergeant Colborn? The same would apply to him. I never met Sergeant Colborn before, so I didn't know who he was. I was introduced to him, but I can't be certain what time they actually showed up at the scene. All right. Now, when you first arrived at the RAV4 location at approximately 3 o'clock, you were actually the first Calumet officer to relieve any Manitowoc officer from security in that immediate area, right? That's my understanding. All right. So that if the first officers, Manitowoc officers, arrived at about 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., that means the first 4 hours that that vehicle was in that location, Calumet was not securing it. Manitowoc was securing it, right? I don't know exactly who was securing it. All I know is I believe the Manitowoc deputy. If there were other DCI officers there, I really don't know. So you don't know what happened before you came. You just know, as far as Calumet goes, Calumet officers, you were the first. That's what I was told. All right. Now, when you went to the command post the first time, when you first checked in at 2:45 or so, you had were you introduced to who was in charge at that point? No, my recollection is when I arrived with Deputy Bass, I was met by Investigator Wiegert and Steyer, and they informed me to respond directly down into the junkyard area. I don't believe I got out and socialized with the group at all. It was just you need to go down there and take care of whatever they need your assistance with. So you weren't told at that time about this decision to transfer authority away from Manitowoc to Calumet County, or were you? I was not. All right. That didn't come until later when you went back to the command post and were given some search assignments. Yes. And you have been with Calumet for how long? Approximately 15 years. So you are pretty familiar with the officers in the other deputies and sergeants and detectives on your staff, right? Right. And you know which ones are evidence collection people and which ones aren't, right? Yes. Some have training in that and some don't, right? Correct. But in your department, you mentioned yourself that you had some kind of training or experience since 1994. Yes. Let me go through a list of some people and see if these aren't evidence collection qualified members of your department. All right? Okay. Deputy Kucharski? Yes. Deputy Reimer? Yes. Investigator Wiegert? I don't believe Investigator Wiegert ever had any evidence. Really? Technician Class? He did some work with arsons and things like that. He was an arson investigator. He did collect all the evidence at arson scenes. What about Detective Dietering? I don't believe Detective Dietering ever had the official evidence class. He may have had some on the job training from other officers, but officially I can't testify that he did. Okay. Gary Steyer? Yes. Jeremy Hawkins? Yes. How about Wendy Baldwin? I don't believe she had any evidence technician training. Any other evidence technician training officers that you can think of on your force? Yes. Who? Keith Risto and Nick Sablik. Okay. So Risto, Sablik, Hawkins, Steyer, Reamer, Kucharski, and yourself? Maybe a correction on that. Deputy Sablik didn't obtain his training until after the Avery case, the initial time on scene. He first went through the class after that. All right, so we'll take one away. 6, right? 6 evidence qualified technicians just on the Calumet Sheriff's Department, right? That would be correct, with the exception that, like Investigator Steyer, for example, when you are promoted to like an investigator position, you have different responsibilities. He doesn't do not called out to things like that for crime scenes for that part, but he is more of an investigator than an evidence collector. Well, hold on just one second there, sir. Let's fast forward here to March 1st and 2nd here for a second. Who was the officer who was collecting evidence on those 2 days? Inside the residence, it was myself. And inside the garage was Gary Steyer, was it not? He was present. I'm not sure what his responsibilities were in the garage. Okay, we'll deal with him later. Anyway, moving back, so there's 6 officers on your force who were evidence collection qualified on November 5th, right? Correct. And we also know the very next day you went out with a team of Manitowoc City Police by the name of Jeff Tech, Tech. Correct. Brian Swetlick? Correct. And Robert Block? Correct. All of whom were evidence collection technicians for that department, right? I don't know what their qualifications were. It was explained to me when I first was introduced to them that Brian Swetlick was a detective sergeant and Jeff Tech was a detective and Rob Block was a patrol officer and evidence collection, right? Officer. And they were part of your team the very next day? Yes. And they were going around and they were collecting evidence, right? Yes. And you wouldn't let somebody collect evidence who wasn't trained to do so, would you? Well, I wasn't in charge of calling those people to assist me. If the investigators felt comfortable with them, they would have made that decision. They would know better than I would at that time what their qualifications were. I trusted the decisions that were being made at the command center. All right, sir. So you watched those 3 officers all day when you were with them, right? Which day? November 6th. That's the Manitowoc officers that we're having a little dispute about here. Mr. Tech, Swetlick, and Block. I was with them. You were them. You never had any concerns about whether they were collecting evidence properly, did you? I had no concerns of their abilities. So those 3 were competent evidence collection people, right? They appeared to be, yes. Okay. So in addition to those 2 departments, there were numerous other law enforcement officers on site on November 5th. Isn't this right? Attorney Kratz then says, I'm going to object, Judge. We're assuming a fact that's not in evidence. Mr. Buting is assuming that those 3 officers were there on the 5th. Perhaps you should ask that question before who else was on site on the 5th. The court says, all right, Mr. Buting, I will ask you to rephrase. And then Attorney Buting continues, all right, you don't know who all was on site, but you know some of the officers on site? Yes. You know that there were numerous departments represented on site on the 5th, right? Yes, there were several. Okay. And you knew that there were crime lab specialists on site on November 5th, right? Yes. You didn't have any decision-making responsibility yourself as to how these teams were put together? That is correct. So, specifically, when you went back to the command post at around 3:15 or 3:30 on November 5th, that's the time when you were given the assignment to go search places. You were paired up with Link, Colborn, and Remacher? No. That came later? That was later. That's right. You went out with some dogs for a while, right? Well, at 3 o'clock, when I got back, they were orchestrating teams to go do the initial entries into the residences. My responsibility was to find out who was going with who, document the times as they reported back. So when the deputies, our officers, returned back to the command center, they would check in with me, tell me the times that they did entry, if it was forcible entry, non forcible entry, and the time that they exited the residence. So I was keeping a log for them, and their times were given to them. Okay. And those were what we heard earlier described as the sweep searches. Right. The brief entries. Yes. Okay. Then after that, you had a brief period of time where you were with some dog handlers, right? I met with the dog handlers, assigned officers to go with the handlers to take their dogs out. Yes. And then you came back. And is that when you were then assigned to go to with Lieutenant Link, Colburn, and Remacher? Yes, it was after all that was done. Now, is this the first time that you, well, let me ask you this. Before November 5th even dawned, did you know about Mr. Avery's lawsuit against Manitowoc County and the Sheriff's Department? Yes. And that, would it be fair to say that that was fairly general knowledge among law enforcement officers in the Northeast Wisconsin area? I don't know if law enforcement officers watch the news like I do, but I was well aware of it. I can't speak for any other officer. All right. If they were following that story. So, at any rate, before you even got there, you knew about that. And when you were first advised that because of that, the Manitowoc sheriff had transferred authority over to Calumet, it was shortly after arriving back at the command post around 3:10. I know the district attorney from Manitowoc County was there. I believe his name is Mark Rohrer. And our district attorney was there, sheriff, and I think there were some high management people within the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. All right. And then when you were given the assignment to go into Mr. Avery's residence, this was about 7:30 p.m. on Saturday evening, November 5th. Yes, we made entry at 7:30. Okay. So you were assigned shortly before that, I assume, right? Correct. Who was making that assignment, Mr. Fassbender or Mr. Wiegert? To tell you the truth, I don't know which one came up with that assignment. I don't know. Okay. Were they both present? They were both in the command center area? Yes. All right. And you said on direct that you were advised to watch them. Make sure that none of Manitowoc officers were alone in the property. That was the initial instruction from the district attorney of Manitowoc County. He made an announcement to all Manitowoc officers that you are not to be alone on the property, period. Were you there when that was made? Yes. Okay. And so was there a discussion of that again with Mr. Wiegert or Mr. Fassbender when you were signed up, paired up with these three Manitowoc officers? I don't think that was reiterated. It was well understood. Well, your assignment inside that trailer, the residence was to, as I recall, was to not actually do the searching yourself. You were just watching, making notes, documenting, right? Yes. So of the four officers in that little trailer, only the Manitowoc officers were the ones actually doing the searching, right? Right. You were doing the watching, right? I was doing the documentation and the watching, right? Yes. You never let them out of your eyesight, did you? I cannot sit up here and look at you guys and tell you that 3 hours inside that residence that I didn't turn my back, walk away, glance away. So I can't say that every second of the close to 3 hours, I was making direct eye contact with them or watching every move they made. Well, you did, I think, at one point describe an incident or moment when Attorney Buting then says, actually, let's put up, counsel, I am going to need your indulgence on this, please, because I don't have the computer animated diagram. Would you be able to put that up? Attorney Strang says, I do. Attorney Buting says, do we? Let me figure out the exhibit number. Attorney Fallon says, what exhibit numbers, counsel? Attorney Buting says, we're going to start with 102. Attorney Fallon says, on the Elmo. Attorney Buting says, yes. And then Attorney Buting continues his questioning. Okay. I'm showing you up on the screen here, Exhibit 101, previously marked. Does that look familiar to you, sir? At least what it depicts? Appears to be the Steve Avery residence. And if you could go look at the bedroom area, actually, I'm going to put up a different one to show you that. 104 is next. Okay. Do you see that? Yes. And is that a representation of the bedroom, back bedroom, Mr. Avery's bedroom, and the hallway bathroom area? Yes. All right. I apologize for that delay, but I believe you said that at one point you were watching them so carefully that Mr. Link, Lieutenant Link, excuse me, walked out of the bedroom into the bathroom area, right? Correct. Through this hallway. And you were standing right here at the doorway while they were searching, right? Originally, yes. In other words, this bedroom really wasn't even big enough for 4 grown men to be walking around and doing things, was it? With the bed, as I previously had testified, Detective Remacher and Lieutenant Link were by the closet area. Sergeant Colborn was up by the desk and bookcase area. All right. So you are indicating the lower part of yes, is the closet. Lower part of this screen here, and the upper is the desk bookcase area? Correct. And you were standing in the door, just inside the doorway. Just inside the doorway. Right. Okay. But you mentioned that when Lieutenant Link went out into the bathroom, you repositioned yourself in the doorway so you could see him in the bathroom and those in the bedroom, right? Yes. You were keeping an eye on what was going on with Mr. Link and Lieutenant Link and the other officers. I would say I was positioning myself to see if they had located any evidence. Well, and you were also trying to abide by the directive that Manitowoc officers should not be alone in any of this property, right? It was more of a documentation type thing. I mean, I did not treat these guys like I did not trust them, okay? Well, let me ask you this, sir. You knew that the district attorneys told those officers not to be alone on any property, right? Attorney Kratz says, a mischaracterization, Judge. He said the Manitowoc County District Attorney. If he could rephrase the question. Attorney Buting says, I don't particularly care which district attorney. It's a district attorney. All right. And then Mr. Buting continues. You knew that? Yes. You knew that it was important to the prosecution or some attorneys on site that these officers not be alone anywhere on that Avery property, right? Yes. And you knew that this was Mr. Avery's trailer? Yes. And that if anything, of all the places that they should not be alone, it would be in Mr. Avery's trailer, right? We did not know that on that day. Mr. Avery was the one who was suing them, right? You knew that? I was aware of that fact. Yes. You knew that. That's right. And you knew that's why Manitowoc recused themselves or transferred authority over to Calumet, right? Yes. It was because of this man right here, right? I believe that's correct. And it was this man right here's trailer that you were in. Yes. And so that, of all places, you knew was important that you make sure that these Manitowoc officers not be alone? Correct. And so you kept an eye on them, didn't you? I was watching what they were doing. Yes. Had you ever, in any other search in your entire career, had to act like a babysitter or a watchdog for the officers who were conducting a search? I did not treat this as if I was babysitting. Had you ever, in any of your years as an officer, had to watch the officers who were searching where you were to make sure that they weren't alone. No, this was a first for you, wasn't it? Yes. And you made sure because you were the watchdog here. You were the custodian, the representative of Calumet. You made sure that none of those officers could have planted anything, right? I watched them to the best of my ability within those 3 hours. And to the best of your ability meant you did everything you could to make sure that they knew they were being watched and that they couldn't plant any evidence if they wanted to. They were told the same instructions that I were, that I was going into that residence to document and recover all evidence that was seized. Well, and you did a good job doing that, didn't you? I believe to the best of my ability. Yes. All right. And would you agree with me that it would have been very difficult for Lieutenant Link or Sergeant Colborn to have planted a Toyota key in that residence under your watch? I believe it would have been difficult, extremely difficult, right? It would have been difficult, yes, because you were watching them. To the best of my ability, yes. Did you ever suggest to Mr. Fassbender or Mr. Wiegert that maybe you would like to have some of your own officers in there doing this search that night to Mr. Avery's residence? We didn't have all those officers that you mentioned at the scene that day. You could call them in, right? They were in charge of making those decisions. I didn't know what information they were privy to. You were off duty, right? You weren't working that day. I don't recall if that was my scheduled day or not. I believe that was your testimony. I was at home when I got the phone call, so you were called in. Yes. And there's no reason that other officers that we went through that were evidence collection officers on your force also couldn't have been called in for this assignment, was there? Attorney Kratz says objection, both argumentative and assuming a fact not in evidence. This officer wouldn't know that. Attorney Buting says, I will withdraw it. And then he continues. So your testimony then is that you never questioned Fassbender or Wiegert about their decision, absolutely not, to send Manitowoc officers in. I did not question them or doubt their judgments, no. Of course, they outrank you, don't they? They were the leaders of this entire investigation at that time, right? Yes. And you take orders from them? That's the way I looked at it. Yes. Attorney Buting then says, I'm going to take this down. And then he continues. You testified about a number of these exhibits that you found, right? Yes. And you mentioned that you found this bottle of bleach, which is Exhibit 195 in the bathroom. Is that right? I didn't find it. That was recovered by Deputy Reimer. On a different search then? I believe so. Wasn't even recovered on November 5th? I don't believe so. Okay. But your testimony was that it was found in the bathroom. I recalled seeing a bleach bottle in the bathroom. If that's the very same exact one, I believe it was. All right. Showing you Exhibit 206 and 207. Could you take a minute and just orient yourself with that and tell me what those are? Sure. Number 207 appears to be the washing machine in the bathroom. In the bathroom, right? And what is 206? 206 would be the sink in the bathroom. Okay. And this is the bathroom in Steven Avery's residence, right? Yes. Putting up Exhibit 207 in just a moment here. That's what you have identified as Mr. Avery's bathroom, right? Yes. And you note the floor, the tiling, linoleum on the floor, the hamper. And does that appear to be a shower in the background there? Yes. So when you say that you found or that someone found a bottle of bleach in the bathroom, it was actually in the laundry room, right? If you want to consider that front area to be a laundry room, sure. Well, that's where the washer and dryer is, right? Yes, but it's part of the bathroom. Okay. It's not in the hallway. Would it surprise you to find a bottle of household bleach in someone's bathroom? No. Do you have bleach in your bathroom? I believe it's under the sink in the kitchen. Okay. But certainly bleach is where the laundry room is where people use bleach, isn't it? Yes. Typically, yes. And no bleach was found in the garage, was it? I don't know. I never searched the garage. I'm putting up now on the screen 206, which is the other side of Mr. Avery's bathroom, right? Yes. You recognize the floor, the linoleum, and the hamper sitting there? Yes. I'm just going to zoom in on this for a minute. You see a toothbrush? Yes. Do you see more than one toothbrush? I see the one. All right. And razor? Looks like a razor. Yeah. We'll get to this again in a minute. But you mentioned buccal swabs. You know what buckles are, right? I didn't on that day. When I got to the hospital, it was explained. All right. So now you know what buccal swabs are? Yes. And buccal swabs are basically like a Q-tip that you take and swab inside someone's mouth, their cheeks. Yes. And from that, you get DNA samples, right? Yes. And it's a very good way of collecting DNA, correct? And that's what they tell me. Yes. Much like a toothbrush would be, right? I don't know what the capabilities are from a toothbrush. Well, you know that people put toothbrushes in their mouth all the time, right? With toothpaste, yes. Okay. And so that it would be a fertile source of one's DNA. Attorney Kratz says, objection, Judge, beyond the scope of this witness's expertise. The court says the objection is sustained. Attorney Buting then continues. Did you ever work any missing person cases besides this? Yes. Did you ever have to go to the missing person's house to try and get some personal items that might have their DNA on it for future use? I don't think it ever got to that level. Never got to, in your experience? Yeah, they were located prior to a full-blown investigation. Okay, sure, all right. I'm showing you what I believe is previously marked in your direct as 163. Does that appear right? Yes. And that's a photograph of Mr. Avery's bedroom that was taken on the night of November 5th, right? I believe so. And you can see the gun rack that you just identified, right? Yes. And there's some sort of a firearm in the lower tier of that right in this photo, right? Yes. That's a black muzzle loader. I never identified what type of firearm. Okay. Well, I don't know if you know guns, and frankly, I don't know them that well. But this thing that's hanging down here, do you know what that is? I believe they refer to that as a powder horn. A powder horn. So that's what you used, presumably, with a powder rifle to load it, right? I don't own one. I would assume that would probably be correct. Okay. I just want to be clear. That's not some sort of bizarre sexual device or anything, is it? Not that I'm aware of. Or any kind of torture device, right? I don't believe so. All right. Well, just in case not everybody knows that, I wanted to make that clear. You did mention finding some handcuffs and leg irons, right? Sergeant Colborn found those items. Yes. But you were watching and taking note? Yes. I believe on direct, you testified that it was found in the bookcase. In fact, it was found on a nightstand. Isn't that right? I believe it was the bookcase. You wrote a report of your investigation that day, right? Yes. Would that refresh your recollection if you took a moment to review that? I think I know where you are going with this, and I don't think I need to see it. When I did my report, what is now known as the bookcase, I looked at it to be a nightstand. I would use it as a nightstand myself. So in my report, I did refer to it as being a nightstand. Okay, all right, so you cleared that up. At any rate, these handcuffs and leg irons, these are novelty items that are sold at places like Intimate Treasures and things of that nature, right? Yes, you can get them from stores, I guess. And they are meant for consenting adults for whatever kind of experimenting or play they may do, right? Attorney Kratz says, objection, judge. I'm sure they have a lot of uses. And the court says, well, I think if he knows, he can testify as to what he understands their intended use to be, if he knows. Attorney Kratz says, it's the term consenting adults that I have objection with. Attorney Buting says, well, I think he can tell us. What is it? Attorney Kratz says, it could be unconsenting adults as well. And the court says, well, that's something you can take up on redirect. And then Attorney Buting continues, isn't that right? I mean, they are sold at these adult novelty type places where their intended use is consenting adults engaged in whatever kind of role playing or whatever, right? Sure. Okay. And I'm going to put back up that photograph from number 163 again. There's a headboard in that photograph, right? Yes. And that headboard was later seized by somebody and put into your department's property room, right? Yes. And there came a time when you and some other officers took that headboard out from the property room to examine it, right? And that would be myself and Deputy Hawkins, and also Mr. Fassbender, correct? Not originally, I don't think. Well, did you do a report of that day? Yes. Would it refresh your recollection if you reviewed that? Sure. Page 936. This report, by the way, has, yes, Deputy Jeremy Hawkins' name on it. Right. It reads as if it was written by you. It is written by me. It was a typo by the secretarial staff. Okay, and it says, just take a minute and review that, those first two paragraphs, and then I know where you're going with this as well. Okay, so you don't need to review it? I don't believe so. All right, then I will put it aside and ask you some questions. This is Monday, April 3rd, right? 2006? That would be the second day that we looked at the headboard. The first day we looked at the headboard would have been March 28th. Okay. Well, we're talking about this day. Okay. That was the confusion then when you mentioned, all right, Fassbender. All right. I understand. So I apologize for that. On this day, though, you did have a meeting with actually Sheriff Poggle, right? Mark Wiegert, John Dietering, and Mr. Fassbender? Yes. Special Agent Fassbender? Yes. And a decision was made for you and Deputy Hawkins to take a very good look at the headboard, right? We had looked at it previously, which is why we had consulted with those persons to get further direction. All right. And so you took it out and you put it on freezer paper, examined it like any other piece of evidence, right? Yes. And didn't you, in fact, note from your observations that we could not see any striations around the spindles of the headboard consistent with that of having handcuffs or leg irons secured to the spindles of the headboard? That would be correct. Meaning you looked very, very closely at these spindles depicted in Exhibit 163 on the headboard and saw no scratches. When you say striations, you mean scratches, right? Yes. Scratches you might see from somebody who is chained, arms out to that headboard, right? Correct. Somebody struggling for their life, you would expect to see some scratches? I would think so. And you saw none, right? Nothing consistent with that going around the, all right, entire spindle. Going back for just one moment, Sergeant Colborn, you mentioned was Attorney Buting then says, you can take that back, please. Before we continue, if you're watching on YouTube, you can hit the join button below. Members get early access to episodes. It's the easiest way to support the show without leaving the app. All right, let's continue. And then continues. Sergeant Colborn, you mentioned was searching the desk and bookcase area. Yes. And at no time did Sergeant Colborn ever say, hey, look at this. The back of this bookcase is loose. No. Well, there's a gap here, right? No, I never saw him physically go behind and look at it. He was going through the contents inside. And he never mentioned, and you never saw the back of that moving as he was going through, right? No. Okay. You mentioned some small blood drops or blood stains that were found in Mr. Avery's bathroom. Do you recall that? Yes. Are you aware that none of those drops of blood ever proved to be Miss Hallbach's? I was told that. I read a report. All right. In fact, there was no blood anywhere from Teresa Hallbach was found on any of these blood stains you made note of that night. I was told that. Yes. Okay. So, do you know whose they did turn out to be? I can't testify. Well, we'll get to that. You testified about this exhibit, 200, which is an envelope that was found. Yes, you saw this recovered. I don't believe that was recovered on the 5th of November during the initial search. Oh, okay. But you identified it, so you must have recognized it as an identifier? I saw it. Yes, you saw it. Okay. And the letter is from Attorney Buting says, put the Elmo back on, please. And then he continues. The letter is from UW Madison Law School, right? Yes. The envelope itself? Yes. And it actually contained a letter from the law school dated November 1st, 2005, right? Yes. And it's an invitation. Attorney Kratz says, objection, hearsay, judge. Attorney Buting says, well, this has been introduced as an exhibit. Attorney Kratz says, I don't care. It's hearsay, judge. It's being offered for the truth of the matter. The court says, I'm going to sustain the objection. Attorney Kratz says, thank you, judge. Attorney Buting then continues. You also introduced a number of notebooks? Yes. Just for the record, 199, 197, and 198, right? Christine here, on this exhibit, I'm in the middle of recording, so once I edit this, I'll actually be able to see the exhibit, and I know it's been offered. But I don't recall if it's actually the full letter, but if it's the full letter and it's visible in an exhibit, why would that not be allowed to be read or talked about or mentioned what was actually contained in the letter? I mean, if it's right there in an exhibit. And if it is in the exhibit, can't they just put the exhibit up and let the jury just read it? So anyway, let's continue. He had just asked about the notebooks. And he says, yes. And these are pocket notebooks, right? Yes. We only talked about the one page here that had Teresa Hallbach's number on it, right? Yes. But in fact, all or most of these notebooks have numerous other phone numbers on them too, don't they? Need to look through them? I never paged through them, so, well, just take a moment. Tell me if you see other people's phone numbers, names, things of that nature jotted down. I would also like to clarify something in reference to my testimony yesterday as well. These two notebooks right here, I did see them on the night of the 5th. Detective Rummaker was looking at them. I'm not sure if my testimony yesterday was that he collected them, but reviewing my stuff, he didn't collect these on the night of the 5th. A different officer would have collected these on a day thereafter. I just wanted to correct that. Okay, that's just fine. Thank you. And when you say these, just so the record is clear, you were holding up Exhibit 199, the red notebook, and 197, the green notebook. Okay. Just take a moment and see if there's other phone numbers and names in some of these. Okay. Is that a fair statement? I see numerous different phone numbers, but it's in somebody's handwriting. Well, are you a handwriting expert, sir? Well, it's obviously not the one that had the same writing as on there. Can you identify whose handwriting it is? Back to the door? No. But there are different phone numbers. So if these are as if someone was just using these to just jot down phone numbers and names, right? Attorney Kratz then says, objection, speculation. I'm sure counsel doesn't want us to read everything that's in that notebook. It's hearsay, judge, and it's speculation. And Attorney Buting says you can read every one of them if you want to. The court says it's a fair summary question based on what he already testified to. I will allow it. And then the questioning continues. The exhibit that has the note that has Teresa Hallbach's phone number in it, well, first of all, it's not torn out from the notebook, right? Correct. Not as if this was posted on the door as a note for somebody, is it? Attorney Kratz says, objection, speculation, judge. And Attorney Buting then continues. Do you see any tape on it? Scotch tape? And the court says, I'm going to allow the question. I don't see any tape. Okay. And there's two different colored inks, too, correct? Yes. Her phone number is in green ink, and this other, whatever this other writing means, is in a different color ink. Back to patio door is in black. Okay. As if maybe it was even written at different times. Attorney Kratz then says, objection, speculation, judge. And the court says sustained. Attorney Buting continues. You also introduced a sign, a for sale sign that I don't see the exhibit number here, but I will just show it to you. Attorney Strang says 194. Attorney Buting continues. All right, 194. This is, on one side, it has a for sale sign, like you would buy at a hardware store or something, right? Yes. It's got 1995 Pontiac Grand Am listed, right? Yes. And then on the back, it has got some other writing, 3302 Xander Road, correct? Correct. And then it's got the phone number here that turns out to be Teresa Hallbach's cell phone number, right? Yes. Are you aware that Teresa Hallbach never lived at 3302 Xander Road? I'm not aware of any significance to the address. So as far as you know, there's no connection whatsoever between this address and that phone number, right? I don't know that. You don't know that, or you do know that? I do not know that. Now, you do know, I assume, that Teresa Hallbach had seen Mr. Avery on several occasions before October 31st. I was told that by Investigator Wiegert in advance. Okay, part of your briefing, right? Yes. They sit down and they explain some of the background so you know what's going on, right? Yes. Okay. And in fact, before October 31st, Mr. Avery had Teresa Hallbach's phone number already because he had arranged a private sale with her. Do you recall that? No, I don't recall him having her cell number, what time he had it. I don't know that information. So you didn't know that information. Okay. But if that were the case, finding her phone number in his house on November or trailer on November 5th would have meant nothing, would it? Attorney Kratz says, objection, judge, calls for a conclusion. That's probably what the court says the objection is sustained. Well, when you collected those pieces of evidence, you don't know when those notes, phone numbers were written, right? Detective Remacher collected them, but I did not know when they were written. All right. They could have been written weeks ago, for all you know. True. By the way, you said you weren't collecting the evidence. You were just standing there watching and writing down notes as to the times that things were collected. Yes. But the actual collection itself was done by, or the bagging was done by Lieutenant Link. Yes. Did you watch him seal every single bag? I can't say with 100-degree certainty every single bag, but he was doing his duties. I was there. Yes. Okay. So when you say that you collected the evidence, it was at the end of the night? Yes. After all the bags were sealed and completed, right? Yes. Then it's turned over to you? Yes. All right. And you never saw a Toyota key anywhere in Mr. Avery's bedroom that night, did you? I did not. No. And if you had seen a Toyota key anywhere in that bedroom that night, you would have made note of that, wouldn't you? Personally, I would not have known what a Toyota key looked like. I'm not too familiar with automobiles and their keys. Well, all right. Let me ask it this way. You know that Teresa Hallbach's vehicle was a Toyota RAV4. Yes. You went and looked at it, right? Yes. And so if you found if someone had located a key, a car key inside that residence, you would have either seized it or at least made note of it as possible evidence in the case, right? Absolutely. Particularly if it was a Toyota key, because that may be the key that would fit the victim's vehicle. Absolutely. And you made no such note, right? Correct. And you stood in the doorway for at least a half hour? Yes. Of his bedroom? Yes. All right. I just have one question about this, another exhibit here, and then I will move off of these exhibits. You identified exhibit 205 as a hood latch swab, right? Yes. I just want to make it clear here. This is actually a swab that's dated, or a piece of evidence that's dated April 3rd, 2006. That's correct. And that it was collected not at the crime lab. Correct. So whatever is in this little package is not something that the crime lab found when they went over it very, very carefully on November 8th or 7th, whatever day they had it, right? I was just informed that they did request myself and Deputy Hawkins to who requested? Investigator Wiegert. Okay. So Investigator Wiegert told you to go do this, right? Yes. All right. Let's move on to the next day, November 6th. You are paired with a different team on that day, right? Yes. And we talked about that. Those were the 3 Manitowoc City police officers. Right. And you weren't given any kind of instruction that you had to watch those 3 officers like a hawk while you were doing the search. Did you? Right. There was no concern about whether or not you had to leave those officers alone in any part of the buildings that we're looking at, right? Right. Because Mr. Avery wasn't suing them, right? To the best of my knowledge. All right. And then the next day, November 7th, you were paired again with Link and Colborn, right? That's correct. But not Detective Rummaker on this occasion. His wife was having a baby or had a baby. Okay, good for him. Good for her. So on that occasion, though, you didn't do a thorough search with Link and Colborn of Mr. Avery's residence, right? That's correct. The 2 of them were only in that residence briefly with you when you were trying to get a serial number from a computer, right? Yes. Just a few minutes, I think you said? Yes. So it would have been difficult for them to have planted any evidence in front of you at that occasion, on that occasion, right? Yes. And besides, they were with you, the watchdog, right? I wouldn't call myself a watchdog, but they were with me. Yes. Okay. And no key was discovered on that occasion, was it? By the computer? No. Anywhere in the house? We didn't search the house. We just got the serial number from the computer. So no key, no Toyota key was recovered on November 7th when you were in there with Mr. Colborn and Mr. Link, right? No key was recovered by the computer. No. All right. November 8th, I believe you testified that you weren't even at the Avery salvage yard on that day, right? Not until late in the day, I was at the Calumet Sheriff's Department logging evidence. So the watchdog wasn't there. Attorney Kratz says, Judge, I am going to object. We hear that, Judge, one more time. We're going to approach with a sidebar. The court says the objection is sustained. Attorney Buting then continues. Really getting under his skin, aren't they? He then continues. In any event, you were not with Mr. Link and Mr. Colborn when they re-entered Steven Avery's residence on November 8th, were you? And that's correct. And that is the occasion when a key was found, right? That is my understanding. When you weren't with them, that's my understanding. That sounds a little fishy, doesn't it? On November 9th, you testified about having some different duties, and that was the DNA exemplars were taken from people, right? Yes. And fingerprints were taken? Yes. And palm prints were taken? Yes. And those items were taken for the purpose of trying to see if they might match with some fingerprints that the crime lab had found on the RAV4. Is that your understanding? I had no information as to what the crime lab had found at that time. We were just executing a search warrant based on the specific information within those search warrants. All right. And the search warrant included taking those buccal swabs from each individual that had been, well, just let me name them. The ones you were involved with, okay? Mr. Avery one of them? He was, wasn't he? Yes. Yes, you testified about that? Yes. Also Dolores Avery, right? Yes. Barb Janda? Yes. Chuck Avery? Yes. Earl Avery? Yes. And Bobby Dassey? Yes. And these are what are called elimination type exemplars? Yes. To see if you can eliminate somebody from something that may be found in a crime scene? Yes. Or match them? Sure. Okay. And it included DNA fingerprints and palm prints for all of them, right? Yes. But at the end of that day, though, you received information from a special agent, Joseph Capitani, I believe is the way you pronounce his name. Yes. That the crime lab only wanted the palm prints and fingerprints of Mr. Steven Avery right away, immediately. Yes. And so efforts were made to transfer Steven Avery's palm prints and fingerprints immediately to the crime lab, right? Agent Capitani approached me and stated those words that the crime lab wanted those items immediately. I did give them to him. He signed off on the document, okay, for those items. So he went off to the crime lab, as far as you know, with those items. He left the Aurora Clinic. I assume, yeah, he was en route to Madison. But all the other ones you took and just booked into the Calumet Sheriff's Department? Yes. Do you know the results of any of the comparisons of fingerprints, Mr. Avery's fingerprint standards to any fingerprints found on the RAV4? No. Attorney Kratz then says, I'm also going to object as beyond the scope of this witness's expertise. Probable hearsay as well. Attorney Buting says, I wasn't asking for the results. I just wondered if he knew it. Attorney Kratz says, it seemed like that was the question. Do you know the results? The court then says, as phrased, the objection is overruled. Attorney Buting says he's answered. That's fine. And then he continues. He says, all right, just a few more questions, sir. You talked about, or we talked about this April 3rd date when you were, I think your report called it processing evidence, right? Yes. And there was actually a number of days. You mentioned one in March, but there was a number of days over the next several weeks, March, April, May, when you were going through various items that had been seized from Mr. Avery's residence or garage on one of these searches, either November or March, right? Yes. And your purpose in going through these items of evidence was to see if there was any way you could determine if any of these items of evidence had any link or importance to this crime, right? Yes. And so you were doing things like testing, examining it for blood, items for blood, right? Yes. The bleach bottle, for instance, that's been marked as whatever exhibit it was, this was one of the things that you examined to see if there might be any blood on it, right? Yes. Just a little brown mark on the bottom somewhere that you weren't sure about? Right. This is Exhibit 195. And so you tested this with these presumptive tests that are very sensitive to blood, right? Yes. And it proved negative, right? Correct. No blood. All right. You also looked at footboards for the bed, right? Yes. You looked at a number of pieces of brown paneling, right? Yes. Paneling marked number 1, number 2, number 3, and each of those was negative for any kind of blood, right? Correct. And it's your understanding that these are the panels taken off the walls of Mr. Avery's bedroom, right? Yes. No blood, correct? We did not find any. And there's also some molding, wooden molding also taken from his room somewhere. Yes. Tested for blood, negative, right? Right. There were also some paint thinner cans that apparently were recovered from the garage. Do you recall that? I recall examining them. Yes. You weren't there when they were seized, but you examined them? Yes. And it was determined that those cans had no evidentiary value whatsoever, right? We did some presumptive tests on them, I believe, and got negative results. Correct. And there was also some gas tank or a number of gas cans and I guess snowmobile gas tanks or things of that nature. Correct. You tested all of those, right? Yeah, we swabbed a lot of those gas cans. Anything that we saw that was suspicious, we would do. And they were all negative? Yes. No blood, right? Then you also took, and this would have been on May 1st, a piece of carpeting that was ripped out of the whole hallway of Mr. Avery's residence, right? It was a small piece of carpeting that was correct, cut from the entrance door by the bathroom to the entrance to the bedroom. Okay. In that hallway right outside his bedroom? Yes. Okay. And you actually did a luminol? Yes. And we have heard testimony about luminol. I'm not going to go over it in detail, but that's something that can highlight anything that is of, could be blood, could be a lot of other things, right? Yes. And you found no heavy concentrations anywhere in the carpet indicating any drops of blood had fallen, right? There was no pattern, nothing that was consistent with what you were talking about. Correct. All right. And you even looked at the back of that carpet, right? Yes. That was actually a later date, June 23rd, right? I don't recall that. You were told to pull the carpeting out of, I'm sorry, this was a different piece of carpeting? Okay, that would be consistent. Okay, you pull the carpeting that was ripped out of the bedroom of Mr. Avery, right? Yes. And you actually looked at at the back of it? Yes, the backside. And you did a presumptive test for blood? Yes. And found nothing? Correct. No blood? Nothing consistent with blood. Correct. You also, a number of times, I won't get into all of them, but there were a number of knives, kitchen knives, pocket knives, things like that, that were seized either in the residence or the garage, right? Yes. And you looked at all of those, right? Some were sent to the crime lab, some we kept at the office and processed ourselves. All right. And the ones you processed, you looked for blood, right? Yes. None. Correct? Correct. Attorney Buting says, all right, thank you. The court says, Mr. Kratz, are you going to be doing redirect? Attorney Kratz says, I am. The court says, how much time do you think? And Kratz says, I think I have 2 questions, Judge. So the court says, all right, go ahead. And then Attorney Kratz begins his redirect. Sergeant Tyson, Mr. Buting asked you about that sign that mentioned a Xander Road address. Do you recall him showing you that? Yes. Do you know where that Xander Road address is? No. Do you even know if it's in Calumet County? I heard Xander Road a couple of times on our department radios. Manitowoc County either having a crash or something like that. So I'm familiar with Xander Road probably being in Manitowoc County. I know it rang a bell, but I don't know where it is. Something a Manitowoc officer might be better able to answer? Yes. And lastly, Mr. Buting asked you about somebody relieving you from the scene security, that is from watching over the SUV. Do you remember those questions? Yes. Do you remember what department relieved you? In other words, the scene security from the point that you took over thereafter. Do you know what department was responsible? Calumet County Sheriff's Department. Attorney Kratz says, I think that's all I have for redirect. Attorney Buting says, no questions. And the court says, very well. The witness is excused, and at this time, we will take our morning break. And that's where Tyson leaves the stand. And normally, this is where I tell you about what Kathleen Zellner, Stephen's post-conviction attorney, had to say. And she did have a lot to say, but here's the thing. Tyson's name, it just doesn't fade out after this trial. It comes back in a really, really big way. And I can't get into all of it right now because that would spoil what's coming down the road. But I want you to remember this one moment when Tyson said, "Yeah, Sheriff Jerry Poggle instructed me to grab a camcorder and to go through every single residence." At the time, it just sounded routine, right? Barely a blip in the testimony. The defense didn't jump on this, and the jury probably forgot it the second that he stepped down. But years later, that one order to send Tyson in with a video camera turns out to be far more important than anyone in that courtroom realized at the time. And that will be a story for later. Before we wrap up, though, let's touch on a few things that stood out when Tyson was asked about the order that the Manitowoc deputies not be left alone on the property. Attorney Buting pressed him on where that directive came from, and Tyson said it came from the district attorney. And that's when Kratz jumped in with his whole, mischaracterization, judge. So what was Kratz doing here? Well, it felt like he was, really kind of splitting hairs, trying to minimize things, I guess. Almost as if to say, well, it wasn't me, it was a different district attorney, But either way, it was a district attorney giving the order. And the point stands that people on site knew that Manitowoc officers had to be watched, especially inside Stephen's trailer. That's not nothing. Now let's talk about how this evidence was presented. And the prosecution, they made a big deal about this bleach bottle, right? But they most likely purposefully, I don't know, my opinion, left out the fact that it was sitting right next to Steven Avery's washer and dryer, which just happened to be in the bathroom. And of course, you'd find bleach in a laundry area, but leaving that little part out, that the washer and dryer was in the same room, if you leave that out, it makes it sound a whole lot more sinister to the jury. Then there were the notebooks, and they zeroed in on Teresa's phone number that was written alongside this phrase that said, "back to the patio door." But her telephone number itself is in green ink, and the phrase is in black ink, like they were written at different times, and maybe not even related at all. And the notebooks themselves, they were filled with all kinds of jotted down notes and phone numbers. And, that part, of course, didn't get talked about. According to some testimony, it didn't even get looked through. They just saw that and thought, oh, look, here we go. And here's something else that doesn't sit right. The swab from the RAV4's hood latch. It's dated April 3rd, 2006. That's 5 months after the car was seized on November 5th. Why would they suddenly decide to test the hood latch months later? And who exactly was in possession of this RAV4 during all of those months? And remember how all of the Avery family members were sent in for prints, fingerprints, and buccal swabs, yet the only one that the crime lab asked for immediately was Stephen's. So were the others just for show? Was it a way to look like they were being thorough without actually considering them as suspects? And even then, why did they need Stephen's prints, his fingerprints, in the first place? Wouldn't they already have had them on file from his earlier arrest? And maybe even his DNA, too? All of this raises these questions and concerns, right? Were they building a case around Stephen with tunnel vision while ignoring or dismissing everything else that was right in front of them? And that brings us to what's next. Sergeant Andrew Colborn finally takes the stand. We've heard his name over and over in all these transcripts so far, but now we're going to hear directly from him. So that's who's coming up in the next episode. Thank you. Thank you all so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. We'll talk soon. Bye for now.